Let's talk a little bit about the formation of Spanish society here in the Americas after they began to conquer their territories here and started to colonize. The territories here in the Americas were ruled over by a Council of the Indies that was back in Spain. And the Council of the Indies was in charge of overseeing how they were going to run the land here. So they divided their territories in the Americas into two parts and what they called viceroyalties. So you had the viceroyalty of Peru, which today would be all of South America, and the viceroyalty of New Spain, which contained then Central America, Mexico, parts of the United States along the west that were also Spanish territory, and the Caribbean islands that were theirs. So all of that made up what was known as New Spain. These areas were then governed by royal officials that were known as viceroys and what would be royal governors, who were in charge of then ruling over these territories in the name of Spain. Now, settlers who came over to these colonies now in the New World, they were able to gain land through what was known as an encomienda system. Right? This encomienda was a grant of land. It was a royal grant of land where the king and queen granted you this piece of land. And through the encomienda system, the settlers were also given the authority to tax any kind of Native Americans that were on the land. Or if they weren't going to tax them, then they would have the ability to make them work in exchange for protection from these settlers and conversion to Christianity. Right, so that was the land system and how land was divided here in the territories. As settlers began to live in the New World, right, and as these Spanish colonies began to grow, a social system also formed. We began to see a very clear hierarchy, a very clear system of different classes in Spanish society here in the Americas. Right, at the very top of this system were what were known as peninsulares. And these were the Spanish who were born in Spain, right, and had come over to get to settle here. And these peninsulares were the smallest number in society in the Americas over time, but they did hold the most power, right? They're the ones who were allowed to have the most power in these areas. Then below them, you had what were known as the Creoles. And these were those who were now born in New Spain, right? Those of Spanish parents, their parents had come to Spain. They've been living here for years. And now their children were born in this new territory, and they were known as Creoles. Below them, we had the mestizos, who were then born of Spanish and Native American parents, right? So you had that combination, the mestizos, which means mixed in English. Then you would have the Native American Indians. And then finally, you would have the slaves, right? The enslaved persons, which were usually then now your groups of Africans that were being brought in from Africa. As these colonies grew, Spain created a road system that would be able to connect all of these areas. So from North America all through Central and South America, there was a very complex road system that allowed traveling and trade to happen a lot easier among the Spanish territories. And this was known as El Camino Real. And this road system linked this huge Spanish empire here in the New World. There were three types of settlements that the Spanish had here in the New World. They had pueblos, which were pretty much just towns and trading centers. You also had missions, right, which were like churches, would focus on converting people to Christianity. And you would have the presidios, which were pretty much military forts where these Spanish soldiers would be housed, and they were in charge of keeping order and peace along the territories. Throughout these regions, you would commonly find haciendas or plantations, right? Haciendas had these large estates with lots of land, also usually growing a lot of cattle. They would raise a lot of cattle there as well. Plantations were large farms, right, that would raise cash crops like things like coffee and cotton, tobacco and sugar. But both of these things, what they had in common was the fact that they both needed a lot of workers. And at first, it was Native Americans that were used by the Spanish to work. However, Native Americans used by the Spanish to work pretty much were like in very substandard conditions, forced to work long hours, not getting enough rest or food, kept housed in very poor sanitary locations. So it was a very hard life, and a lot of the Native Americans did not really survive a lot of this work for very long. Some Spanish people began to see what was going on. Among them was a priest known as Bartolomé de las Casas, who wrote about the mistreatment of the Native Americans that was happening here in the colonies, and he would write back to Spain with accounts of what was going on. And eventually, his work led to laws being passed in Spain that made it illegal to enslave Native Americans. Here in the American colonies, it didn't have much of a difference for a time. People kept treating the Native Americans pretty much the same. But what it did do was it eventually, once it became completely illegal and it started to be enforced that the Native Americans could no longer be used, the only thing that happened then was instead of using Native Americans, the Spanish then turned to using the African slaves. Right, so more slaves were now being brought in from Africa through the slave trade to use to work into these areas instead of the Native Americans. So not really a big difference into the way things were done. All they did was just kind of change the groups that they were using.